Good evening all, and welcome. Many times we hear stories of creepers and strangers, people we don't know, who definitely scare us for a variety of reasons. But could it be that those who we should fear the most are those who live in close proximity? They do know where we live after all. It's time for you to get comfortable. Make sure you know your neighbors well, and let the darkness take control. I'll begin by saying I live in an apartment building with 5 connected 2-story townhomes. My next door neighbor is the last home on the building. He has seemed just like a normal guy so far. He told us he has bipolar anxiety and PTSD. That's fine. I even provided him with some information on how to get some counseling sessions. Last night, my partner and I got home, and he was smoking outside his house. Whatever. He had a short conversation with us, and he apologized for his friend getting drunk, and he had to stop him from going on a shooting spree. I didn't hear anything. It was weird, but we were both tired from work, so we just kind of wrote it off. Fast forward. My partner and I had been laying in bed for about 30 minutes. It's 2 a.m. and we hear a knock. I feel like deep down inside, I wanted to believe it was the neighbor's door. Maybe a friend had come over. Another knock. Oh no, that's definitely our door. Another knock. Another knock. There became less and less time between each knocking. My partner and I are looking at each other. We don't know what to do. This was the 6th or 7th knock at this point. As we open our mouths to discuss our options, there's an insanely loud bang. This guy is either hitting or kicking our door, so hard that the windows are shaking in their frames. And that's when the howling started. Guttural, demonic howling, screaming, horrific moaning. My partner grabs my best chef knife, and I curl myself into a corner of my hallway, unsure of what to do. Call 911? Yes, he says. Call now. My partner is braver than I, and went down the stairs and to the door. Through the window, my partner says, "It's 2 a.m. We're sleeping. What are you doing?" And just like this, weirdo Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he snaps back to his normal personality and just says in his meek voice, "Oh yeah, sorry, I'm sorry," and walks away. What in the ever-loving heck? So my partner comes back upstairs, and we are both just tucked into the corner of our hallway, listening to this guy's footsteps in the attached unit. It seemed like forever for the cops to arrive. It was probably 20 minutes, but I'm just semi-hyperventilating in the corner of my hallway with a chef knife in hand's reach, just listening. I don't know what I thought would happen. I just didn't want him to come back or have another episode, so I listened. The cops came and I talked to both parties. Contacted my landlord this morning. Apparently this guy had already contacted the landlord to complain about the noise we were making. What? So even though he's still my neighbor for the time being, I hope not to meet him again. I am a female living in New England. To add another detail, this took place in a decent neighborhood. We weren't white trash or anything. Anyway, here it goes. Several years ago, the day before my 10th birthday, I was arriving home with my mother and little brother from a soccer game that my brother had. We were arriving at our own house when my brother noticed a yard sale next door. This house was run down. Apparently, some police activity went on before I was born, but that was over now, right? So a man walks up to us, and he introduces himself. We'll call him Ray. Ray was renting from the woman next door. Basically, this woman had a house with 4 rooms. One for her, one for her disabled son, and 2 for whoever paid money to live there for any amount of months. Ray seemed nice. He played a bit of soccer on the sidewalk with my brother and spoke nicely to my mother. He looked a bit trashy, but I didn't care. I just wanted to go inside my house and play Minecraft. So I left, not thinking much about the ordeal. This was in October. In late January, a few months later, I was barely awake when my dad picked me up out of my bed and carried me into the master bedroom, where my mum and brother were. The master bedroom is the furthest room away from the place where Ray was. I didn't like being disturbed, so I ran back to my own bedroom. My dad yelled, saying that there were police next door and I should go back into the other room. I did as I was told. I was so scared. Apparently, Ray's ex had gone over to the house to pick up some of her things. She brought her new boyfriend along, and Ray started stabbing the boyfriend, and police were called. Guns and all. I thought it was a one-time occurrence. I thought I'd be safe after that. It was March now. My mum picked me up from school as usual. My brother was staying after school for guitar lessons. She'd get him later. I threw my backpack in the trunk and asked why there were so many suitcases in the back. She cheerfully explained that we were staying at a hotel. We drove around town, and she finally said my dad would take me back home, that we wouldn't be staying at a hotel. I came home with Dad. I noticed there was police tape on our lawn. My dad said they'd found drugs in Ray's house. That comment really didn't settle in until later. The full story was, Ray was doing PCP on his own front steps. Someone noticed and called the police. Police came, half chased Ray into the next town over, and half investigated the house. An officer picked up the package with drugs and immediately begins to have a bad reaction. Hazmat was called, and they find a drug lab. Thinking it's a meth lab, the police advise my mother to evacuate, which she does. Turns out it wasn't meth, so we could come back. But he was manufacturing this other stuff. My mum arrives home with my brother a few hours after I did, and that's when reality sets in. I had an anxiety attack. I couldn't eat, and sat behind our couch, using it as a makeshift bunker. I didn't sleep that night. A bit later, Ray, newly released from jail, does more illegal things. But the evidence room was tampered with, so he couldn't be convicted. Meanwhile, my family has brought a new house, a large dog, security cameras, and plenty of weapons. My brother and I already attended therapy, but now our sessions happened more frequently. We were moving in 2 months. Meanwhile, Ray would watch us from his back porch, just sitting there. My dad confronted him once, and Ray started shouting death threats. The day we moved, Ray let his pit bull loose. It was in the evening, and he didn't know we had already left. He just knew it'll be around the time we were generally walking our dog. Finally, 1 month later, the big one hit. Ray strolled into a local food store, high on that stuff he was making. He picked up a small child and tried to run. When the parents noticed, Ray dropped the child and tried to hide, but the police found him He was fully released from jail a month later because the cells were too full. No transfers, nothing. It was like he was acquitted, although I'm not sure what of the outcome of the whole ordeal. If he was capable of kidnapping, would he have done that to me? What about my brother? Ray, I hope you overdose. I gave you a chance, and you gave me and my brother childhood trauma. In the spring of 2007, I was a man living alone in an apartment complex on the bottom floor of a 2-story building. I'd been living there for 2 years, with no incidents worth mentioning, when a couple of guys in their 20s moved into an apartment upstairs. Occasionally there would be loud arguments going on in their unit, but nothing I paid much attention to at first. One night, I was up late at around 10:30. There was a dumpster just across the parking lot from my door, and I took some trash out to it. As I walked back to my place, I was vaguely aware that one of the new tenants was standing out on the upper landing, but I thought nothing of it. In hindsight, his roommate must have just been out there for the night. So, it was just this one guy by himself getting drunk. After I got in and shut my door, there was a knock. Not being paranoid at that point, I opened up. Standing there was the guy I'd just passed beneath. He had a half-consumed 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor cradled in his arms like a baby. I had the impression he'd been drinking directly from that bottle, but whatever the case, he wasn't sober. Of course, I did not invite him in. He introduced himself and started chatting away as if he'd been just a friendly new neighbour stopping by in the middle of the day to get acquainted. As he talked, he was stroking his bottle, like it was a cat or something, giggling like girls do. If this wasn't creepy enough, he began to ask me a lot of personal questions, and he had a bizarre grin as he stared at me. He prattled on and on. I became more and more convinced that he was hitting on me, but I was afraid to be rude to him, because he was a big guy and I wasn't. When he stopped babbling to catch his breath, I told him as politely as I could that it was nice to meet him, but getting late, and I needed to sleep. And still, he kept jabbering away, so I kind of smiled and waved goodnight, then shut my door on him mid-sentence. I heard him pound on my door once more and say, "Arsehole." Then I heard him stomp back up the steps, which were right next to my door. I was about to find out that once he got angry, he stayed angry for a long time. By now, it was close to 11 p.m, but I was too nervous to sleep. All was quiet for about 5 minutes, when suddenly I heard a very loud bang on my front window. I pulled apart the vertical blinds, and he was standing out there pointing at me, with the scariest look of rage in his crazy eyes. He made a weird gesture that I couldn't interpret, and I immediately backed away from the window, letting the blinds fall back into place, half expecting him to break the glass. He shouted something in a drunken slur that I couldn't make out, but there was no other noise until I heard him run back up the stairs again. At this point, I thought it might be time to call the cops before he came back down. Now, the police dispatchers in this city had earned a bad reputation. They would keep asking questions about any situation until they found an excuse not to send anyone. That was my experience. A female answered my call and asked if my neighbour was specifically at the door or the window. Right at this very moment, I peeked out and saw that he wasn't, but I tried to explain the circumstances. She told me there was nothing she could do at this point, but that if I later have a life-threatening emergency, I should call 911. I thanked her for being so very, very helpful and ended the call. I didn't bother with police after that. A few moments later, I heard the first of many thuds outside. It sounded like someone had landed at the bottom part of my door, as if thrown from the stairway above. I couldn't see what it was through my peephole, and was now too terrified to even open the door and find out. I stood around my living room, wide awake into the night. Every once in a while, I heard some thuds, several splats, and then the shattering of what I correctly assumed was his now empty booze bottle, all just outside my door. After what seemed like forever, it finally stopped, and I got 2 or 3 hours of sleep until morning. When I got up, I opened my door to look around. Aside from all the broken glass from the large bottle, it looked like the weirdo had emptied out his entire refrigerator and garbage bin just to throw stuff at my apartment. I got a broom and cleaned up what I could, but there was a blob of goo made of some kind of flour and broken eggs that had landed on top of it. This stuff had hardened into a glue-like mass that I couldn't scrape up. Anyhow, I thought for now I would leave it there, just to show people what this nutjob had done. As soon as I could, I went to the property office to complain. The manager sympathized with me, because the weirdo had given her a bad time too. He'd been coming to the office yelling and cussing at her, refusing to pay rent, and even threatening her. She hated him and wanted him gone. She had me write up a testimony of what happened to help her in her case against him. I should mention that this happened in California, and there are laws that require a lot of legal red tape before anyone can get evicted. Even with the most unruly, deadbeat tenants, the process can take months. I spent the following night sleeping at my parents' place. A friend stayed with me in my own apartment the night after that, but we had no trouble from the lunatic upstairs. The next day, another neighbour asked me about the hideous lump of goo that was still in front of my door. I explained everything, and he told me to pour boiling water on it so that I could clean it up. I took his advice, and it worked. In the meantime, the crazy guy's roommate was back, and they frequently fought. One time, I heard the roommate say he was getting out of there, and the crazy one threw a potted plant at him as he went down the stairway. Another time, I saw them in the parking lot fighting over their pet chihuahua. The weirdo punches the other guy and storms upstairs with the dog under his arm. I found out later that the roommate was living in the US illegally and had nowhere else to live, so he kept coming back to stay with the maniac. After a week or two, I hadn't had any encounters with the creepy guy, but then one night, someone outside shouted fire. Looking out my window, I could see the dumpster engulfed in flames. Firefighters arrived, and I went out to join the small crowd watching them put it out. I noticed my very scary neighbour standing next to one of the fire crew, talking to him, but glancing in my direction. When the fire was extinguished, I turned to go inside. As I walked away, I overheard my neighbour tell the firefighter that I was a weirdo. I don't know who really set the dumpster on fire, but I have my suspicions. Next day, I checked back in with the apartment manager to see if we were any closer to seeing the last of that guy. She told me the wheels were in motion, but it would take more time. She also informed me that the weirdo was going around the complex slandering me, telling people that I was a peeping Tom. She scoffed. She knew he was full of shit. The last big incident happened like this. One afternoon, a woman who lived elsewhere in the complex found the roommate sitting on the sidewalk near our stairs. He was bruised and bloodied and looked like he couldn't stand up. She asked him if he wanted her to call an ambulance, but he told her no. Just then, the weirdo came running down the stairs yelling at the woman. "What makes you think you can get involved? It's none of your business." Then he took a swing at her, and she ran off. A short time later, she came back with some police officers. The bloody man was no longer there, and neither was the other guy. The cops went up and knocked on the door, and got no answer. I never saw either of the two men again. Several days passed while I was worried the scary one would come back, but he didn't. One day, a few weeks ago, I was heading for the mailbox at the front of the complex. A man in a black shirt and pants came up to me holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a detective and showed me a picture. It was the roommate. I first thought the guy in the black was from ICE or something, but apparently the pictured man's relatives had reported him missing. Unfortunately, I couldn't provide any information the officers didn't already have. I never had any trouble from the psycho's roommate, so I hoped he was okay. I live in an apartment complex with my husband and 13-month-old baby in a bad area of my city. Last night, my husband was at work, as he works until 11 p.m. most days, and I kept hearing strange noises coming from my balcony. I turned the porch light on, expecting to see a stranger with a toothy grin and a knife in his hand. Instead, I saw nobody and went back to do what I was doing. Again, I heard a strange noise and nervously checked. Nobody. Nothing. I thought to myself that if it was just my neighbors outside, then I was probably weirding them out by opening my slider door, turning the light on, turning it off, and turning it back on. So I came back inside and shoved some headphones into my ear holes so that I would stop frightening myself. This worked beautifully, and I forgot all about the noises I heard. Typically at around 9:30 or so, I take a hot and relaxing bath to prepare my mind for slumber. I got caught up on something on the interwebs though, and I ended up not getting up from my kitchen right before 10 p.m. Around the time I arose to bathe, I heard a pounding outside my apartment door. I glanced out my apartment's peephole and saw no one. I could only see one other apartment, as there are 4 on my floor, out of the peephole. And since I am nosy, I decided to wait until maybe I could see this person. They were really pounding on the door quite hard, and it was shaking the apartment door. After probably 8 minutes or so, the pounding stopped. I waited. Still no one. The neighbors hadn't answered their door yet either, as you can hear everything through these doors. The silence continued for maybe 5 more minutes, and a couple of minutes after I walked away, it started again. This time, though, it sounded like it was on my own door. Now, I'm a very anxious person, and I do not like being alone in my apartment at night, and refuse to open the door if I don't absolutely have to at night. So I cautiously looked through my peephole and saw absolutely nothing. This terrified me. I messaged my husband, and he told me to call our building's security. The pounding got louder and louder, and then it stopped for several minutes, and then abruptly continued. This went on for some time. I stared out my door's peephole, wondering what the hell was going on, as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe someone actually is knocking on the neighbor's door, and it just sounds like they're knocking on mine. Maybe someone's locked outside and is pounding on that door. Then my thoughts were disrupted as someone began to scratch at my door. My apartment door is metal, so I could distinctly hear the sound of a person's nails running across it. I glanced out the peephole, terrified as to what creepy creature I might discover. Again, no human in sight. I then decided that I should go to my closet in my bedroom and call security away from the front door and far enough away from my baby's bedroom so that she couldn't hear me. But right as I'm about to walk away, I saw something through the peephole that made me audibly gasp. I saw a man slowly stand up. I had never seen him before. I couldn't see him prior to his standing, because the peephole doesn't see that far down. I'm pretty sure that he was crouching down and waiting for me to open my door to see what the hell was happening, and then do who knows what. So I'm glad that I didn't open my door. First off, the man looked pretty normal. If I saw him and he wasn't standing up, crouching near my door, I wouldn't have taken a second glance at him. I couldn't really tell his height or eye color. The peephole kind of distorts everything. He was white and had brown hair. His facial expression was very calm, but it seemed like the kind of calm that you witness when someone is about to lose their mind. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Just so that you're aware, by the way, my apartment is directly in front of the stairs and the locked door that leads outside, as people have to buzz their apartment of choice to get in without keys. So I have a very clear view of the main front door and the apartment to my left. I cannot see the other two apartments on my right and the stairs leading to the third and final floor. Anyway, after the man got up, he went down the stairs, but he did not exit the building. He turned around the corner, probably to attempt to creep out some other folks, although I heard no more additional pounding. So maybe he lives down there, or was staying someone who lives down there. I shakily called the police after he left. They came into my apartment and filed a report. They didn't really seem to care much though. I'm sure they get a ton of calls from people in my crappy neighborhood. At least I made a report though, right? It was very difficult for me to sleep that night. I sleep with my back to the open window and wear earplugs. I know it's weird. They were a necessity when I was a teenager and had a drunk father come home at 2 a.m. when I needed to wake up for 6 a.m. for school. So now I can't sleep without them. And I kept imagining someone somehow breaking through the window and slicing my throat, and my husband wouldn't hear me because he was in the living room with a handset playing Destiny. Nothing out of the ordinary happened that night though. Last night, I was afraid that I would hear it again, and as I was about to get into the bathtub, I did hear knocking. It startled me at first, but then I heard one of my neighbors yelling in Spanish. I couldn't understand him, but I'm pretty sure the poor guy got locked out by his young daughter. So I guess this ends up being rather boring, which is good. My husband immediately brought a dowel to stick in our slider, and we also brought one of those really overpriced sticks that you put under your doorknob for extra protection. And here is my number one question. Besides what the hell this weirdo was doing crouching and knocking, why didn't any of my neighbors hear him? It wasn't even 10 o'clock at the time. That incident seriously unnerved me, but it didn't end there. So about 1.5 weeks ago, I snatched up my baby and we had plans to go to the store to buy a couple of things. When I got outside of my apartment building, there was a woman crying almost directly in front of it. I gave her a look of sympathy to sort of say, "I hope you're alright," without prying into her business. Then I noticed the man who was standing next to her and holding her shoulder. I probably gave him the strangest look, but I was 99.7% sure that it was the man who had been knocking and scratching at my door a week or so earlier. The woman he was holding was my neighbour, who lives directly beneath me, apartment number 4. There are a lot of people that visit and possibly live in that apartment, and I reckon I hadn't seen him before, or maybe he was her new boyfriend or something. Anyway, I found the man. I was certain of it. He looked fairly normal too. I walked to my car, and as soon as I noticed the police cars in the parking lot, there were about 7 or 8 of them scattered around, I wondered what the hell had happened. I really wanted to stick around and watch this shit show unfold, but I didn't know if this is true for every neighborhood. Growing up in the hood, if any sort of fire truck, ambulance, or police cars were going to be seen at houses or a house, the entire neighborhood would walk down the block to stand around and gawk. I understand this behavior, but it annoys me an unbelievable amount, so I drove away. When I returned about an hour and a half later, the police were still there. I assumed the whole thing was about a break-in, or maybe the neighbor had a lot of pot in their apartment or something. Eventually, I just forgot about it. So I go on living and hope that I don't see this man at my door or near my apartment or outside. And I don't. Life is good. And then last week Monday, the 6th. The only reason that I remember the date is because this was the first time that I took my younger sister to donate plasma, and I had set up the appointment. I brought my sister and niece back to my apartment to hang out for a bit. As I was going up my stairs, I immediately noticed a truly awful smell that made me instantly gag. Now, I have a very strong stomach. I don't usually gag over smells. Years ago I worked maintenance at a grocery store and had to clean out the 8-ish foot long dairy drain. If you don't know what year-old rotten milk smells like, it smells exactly like the biggest puddle of diarrhea wrapped in a giant turd. I gagged, and then entirely joking, I told my sister that someone must be cooking meth in their crappy little apartment. Now I don't know what someone cooking meth smells like. I was more of a pot, shrooms and LSD kind of gal back in the day, but it smelt like burnt plastic or rubber and had a very strong chemical odor to it. It was exceedingly harsh smelling. In retrospect, I probably should have called the police, but I didn't think much of it and wouldn't have known what to say. "Hey, cop that I am speaking to on this cellular telephone device, what the heck is the aroma of cooking meth?" Anyway, yesterday my husband wakes up and there's a Facebook message on his phone from a friend of his. It's a voice recording that she sent him. "Bro, there are 5, 6, 7 cop cars outside your apartment. What is going on?" Yeah, looks like they're checking out the apartment underneath you, like, "Ma'am, what's going on?" Very eloquently said. Anyhow, she sent that message at around 3 a.m. After he responded to the message later that day, she mentioned that the cops were busting through their windows and whatnot, as they're on the first floor. Now, this would have been happening right beneath our bedroom window and/or our baby bedroom window, and we heard absolutely nothing. Because we are nosy humans, my husband asked his friend from work, who lives a couple of apartments down from them, if he knew anything about it. It turns out that he did, in fact. The friend said that the cops were there because they had a meth lab in their apartment, and they had been cooking meth for some time. I know that this is just hearsay and all, as the friend heard it from someone else, but I am convinced that the man who was lurking around my apartment was on meth. and maybe that's why he was acting like that. He didn't really seem to be on drugs to me though, but as I previously stated, I have never been around anyone on meth. Does the smell of it cooking smell like chemically plastic? That is just the worst description ever. Would a person on meth act how he did? Or am I just jumping to conclusions? Also, why would the cops have been there the first time? I saw the police go into their apartment and no one was arrested that I could tell. They wouldn't have just let someone off the hook if they found meth supplies used to manufacture meth inside of their apartment. Any speculations are welcome. A few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale but couldn't afford a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I realized there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45, but looked much older. She would sit up all night, listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened the door, and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colours, and words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp and yellow, with stained 50-year-old carpets, dog crap and cockroaches everywhere. No dog though. I asked her to please keep it down. She just looked at me and shut the door. Then she turned up her radio even louder. The next night, I had my girlfriend staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person who's next to the bed, looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbour, and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night, and who knows how long she stood there. "You should lock your doors at night," she says, and walks out. The next morning, I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbour talking to herself in tongue. She has a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside, and I can smell death from the bag. At this point, I'm scared shitless. She's obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask what the hell is going on. The guy is just as scared as me. Apparently she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack, only to find her behind the couch, staring at them, holding a power drill. Now I know what was in her hand. At this stage, I'm basically pooping myself. I call the cops, and they know about her. Apparently she's a violent schizo, and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sit up for the next 2 days, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over there in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution. And in less than a minute, it's over. It's like she was never there. I'll never see her again and still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep. My parents bought their first house back in 1972. It was a fixer-upper, but they decided to move in right away and fix things as time and money permitted. Within a few days of moving in, the new neighbours came over to introduce themselves. They also let my parents know that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. They had lost their second baby from SIDS, and their relationship went downhill from there. My parents were horrified, more so because they were newly pregnant and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot about it, and life went on. They were in love with their new life and their new home. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. Now, my dad told my mum there was no need in wallpapering the inside closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside, when her eyes fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice. Written in crayon, about the eye level for a kindergartner, in childish scrawl was written, "I killed the baby." We moved a lot when I was a kid, but throughout high school, I always used the same bus stop. It was about a half block away, where our quiet suburban street intersected with a slightly busier one. I was often there alone early in the morning. For the longest time, the most interesting thing that might happen was a raven scolding me from a tree, or that a family of deer would follow me from the park across the street from my house to the bus stop through the fog, and past me to walk into the forest preserve beyond the intersection. It was a quiet neighborhood, and only a handful of cars might pass by while I waited for the bus. The deer stopped following me after the harassment began. That morning, a Jeep suddenly hits the brakes and slowed to a stop in front of me. The driver had all the windows rolled down, even though it was a chilly, wet autumn morning, one of those days where the mist just clings to and saturates everything, and the clouds are so low in the sky that you feel like the world is just a big room that you're in. Because of the fog, they hadn't seen me until they were a few meters away, and their braking made a screeching sound. They stopped their car, and the driver just sat there staring straight at me. I couldn't make them out. They were wearing a light grey hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses. I didn't see anyone else in the car. After about 30 tense seconds, during which my bemusement gave way to concern that someone was going to hit this guy stopped in the road, he finally turned to me, yelled a racial slur, smiled, and took off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was newish to the area. I'm not great with faces, and I figured it was one of the kids at the high school trying to be edgy, or maybe just a local asshole who had mistaken my ethnic background. Either way, I didn't think about it at all until next week, when it happened again. This time the guy had friends with him. The windows were tinted, and they only cracked them down so that I couldn't see them. He yelled a different slur at me, and I could hear their laughs as they drove away. This continued to happen, sometimes twice a week, sometimes going months in between. They sounded young, so I continued to write it off as another local weirdo hazing ritual. But gradually, it began to get under my skin. There were two things that bothered me about it. First, the slurs. They were ugly and hateful, and they sounded promisingly violent to me, even though I felt like they could tell that I wasn't a Mexican or an Asian person or any of the other groups they use slurs for. Second, their license plate was obscured every time. This is a very wealthy area, and the local law enforcement wouldn't call anyone out who lived there on a violation, so I wasn't surprised that they got away with it. But it did give me a pause. One morning, I was ready to yell back at them, but instead of yelling anything, they just swerved at my location on the sidewalk. I jumped out of the way and ran behind a fence, but the Jeep ended up whipping through where I had been standing before speeding off. I figured the kid had overshot it and hadn't actually meant to hurt me, but some of the things that followed have since made me wonder. One morning, I came up to the bus stop, and there was just blood all over the area where I usually stood. It was wet for the rain, but otherwise congealing, turning dark in places. But I knew what it was. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was off-putting. A few days later, there was a dead animal there, mangled and brutalized. It wasn't roadkill. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Even after getting on the bus, it wasn't there when I returned in the afternoon. It wasn't an accident. I felt certain of it. It looked to me as though it had been stabbed repeatedly. Extreme overkill. I started to see the Jeep outside the morning bus stop, but the windows were never down, and it always sped off when I looked at it, or I otherwise couldn't get to it before it left. This carried on for years. One day in the summer, I was walking through my neighborhood with a friend, and the Jeep came by at a very high speed, and an egg hit me in the chest. It flowed down my shirt and onto my pants, and all I could think to do was turn to my friend James and say, "You saw that, right?" Because until then, no one else had ever witnessed the events, and my family members seemed skeptical when I mentioned it. I had to go home and change my clothes and take a shower, since the egg hit me at such high speed that it went into my hair and everywhere. It was then that I started to take this situation more seriously, and I had a bruise for weeks. I started to catch a ride with my brother in the mornings, or wait behind the local NFL player's fence until I heard the bus coming down the street. I didn't ever go outside until I had text confirmation that my ride was there. If I heard a car coming on a walk, I would run off into the bushes. They swerved at me a few more times, and then I never saw them again. Some other strange things happened, and I've had stalkers since, but I've never been able to connect them to the events, nor figure out who the people in the Jeep were, or where they lived. My parents have moved to a different part of the community now, but I'm still jumpy when I walk around in that area. Creepy Jeep psycho neighbor, whoever you are, let's never meet again. When I was about 12, my mother and father owned a tow trucking company. This particular day, they went to our neighboring state, so I had a few friends over, and we were there alone. They probably came over at around 12 p.m. We were doing the normal preteen stuff, watching movies, eating junk food. It was winter, so it started to get dark pretty quickly. We were expecting my mother and father to be home any time between 6 and 7. A little before my mum and dad were supposed to be home, there's a knock on my door. The way my house was set up, the front door was right next to my living room couch, where all of us were hanging out. Anywho, my mum is known for kind of being stuck in the 80s, and she always wore a leather jacket. One of my friends, Tina, looks through the window of the door and says, "It's your mum. I can see her jacket." I jump up immediately and look through my window. It's pretty dark at the time, and I don't see my father's tow truck. I run to the front door screaming to Tina, "Don't answer the door, it isn't my mum." But it was too late. She opens the door, and here comes this 6-foot, 250-pound man with a black stocking over his face, running through my door. All my friends ran out of my living room to the kitchen, where the back door is located, and ran away. Me, on the other hand, I obviously learnt that my fight, flight, or freeze response is to freeze. This man grabs a hold of me, picks me up into the air, and I am so scared. I actually peed my pants. I don't remember what happened, but I managed to escape his grip and run out of my back door and down the block to a neighbour's house. We called the cops, and within a couple of minutes there are 6 cop cars, 3 on each end of the block. And we come to find out it was my own grown-ass neighbour. He was allegedly trying to play a trick on us, a bunch of little girls. He was always a creep. To this day, as I'm 26 now, whenever there's a knock on my door, I literally creep around my house so that people can't see or hear me, and I hide until they're gone. So, asshole neighbour, let's never meet again, or I will punch you where it hurts. This happened to me a while ago, but I remembered it when I was talking to some friends recently, and thought that you guys may appreciate it. I attended a small liberal arts university between a desert and some mountains in the southwestern United States. After a couple of years, I opted to move off campus with my boyfriend, and we found the cheapest housing imaginable in a tiny town across the wash and up against the mountains. Very few people lived there, and except for us, all of them belonged to 2 minority groups that hated each other, some of which were involved in active gang warfare that I suspected was related to the drug trade in a nearby city, a very large and depressed one for that area. We lived in a small gated complex with a sad pool and 6 studio apartments, and things in the area were just kind of strewn about. There was no landscaping on any of the properties, just desert sand everywhere. Chickens and dogs roamed free, and you could hear gunshots nearby sometimes. We lived there because the rent was $120 a month, compared to the $1,200 a month apartments in any of the nearby towns. I made friends with neighbours on both sides of the violence and was treated well by everyone. We just tried to be helpful, but otherwise kept to ourselves, and living there really wasn't bad. The police would, however, take forever to appear if ever you did have a problem. The morning was on a weekend, but I was helping some professors with field work in the high desert, so I had to head out unusually early. I dragged myself into some clothes at 5 a.m, grabbed the equipment I needed, and loaded up my car, chiding myself for not picking anything up for food, as I was probably going to be in the rural desert areas well into the afternoon. As I was getting into my car, I saw a huge, angry-looking man heading my way from across the street. He was athletic-looking, like a bouncer, was at least 6'4", wearing what the locals refer to as a wife-beater and jeans, and in his early 40s. I only barely had enough time to discreetly hit the lock button before he was right beside the driver's side window. It was a good thing I did, because he immediately tried the handle. "What do you think you're doing?" he said in a very pissed off tone. I looked around the empty streets, as if some other person would materialize and make sense of this for me. I had never seen this guy before. I wondered if anyone knew I was there. "Well?" He really did look mad, and he was staring down at me through the window, inches away. "What?" I said. placing the key in the ignition to start my tiny Avail. But he put himself so close that I couldn't move without the risk of hitting him. "You heard me. What are you doing?" "Driving?" I said, trying to read his expression. "The hell you are. Get out the car now." I looked around more frantically, but everyone was asleep behind multiple barriers. I began to imagine him dragging me into the dark housing project across the way. Being pulled into a van might be even worse. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just stared at him, hoping he didn't notice my right hand behind me, fumbling for my phone. I said, "Get your ass out the car. Get out the car." At this point, he starts pounding his fist on the glass of my window. Not hard enough to break it, but threateningly. I honk the horn once, but it's puny and quiet, and no one appears. Thanks, Chevrolet. I finally muster enough confidence to say, "What's the problem here?" and sound reasonably incredulous. My thoughts are racing. No one would think twice about a broken window. It would take hours for my boyfriend to notice my car is still here. I left my knife inside, and I gave my pepper spray to a friend. I don't have anything to really defend myself with. "If you don't get out this car this instant, I'm gonna drag your ass out of it." He's still yelling. I feel trapped and frantic for a moment before he continued. "And get your parents out here, and they'll give you a whooping you ain't ever seen." A wave of hope crashed over me, and I was momentarily suspended between fear and relief. "What? How old are you anyway?" Carefully, in full view of him, I pulled out my wallet and withdrew my license, placing it against the glass so that he could read it, and leaning around it so that I could see him, and so that he could see that it was my face on it. He stared at it for a moment, and then broke into a wide, sheepish smile, and began to back away. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, miss." "I'm sorry. I thought you were like 14. I thought you were taking your parents' car for a drive." And I was like, "That kid can't drive. No way that kid can drive. You look very young. I'm sorry." He headed back across the street, then, as an afterthought, said, "That hat makes you look very young. Have a nice day." I tried to smile and wave good-naturedly. I realized the guy felt bad, and instead of a violent, rapey gangster, was most likely a thoughtful, concerned citizen. He actually looked a lot nicer now, as he continued to wave awkwardly. I caught my breath, put my Aveo in gear, and got out of there. I decided I would stop somewhere to pick up breakfast, after all. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. You know, I really liked the turnaround in that last story. It just goes to show that sometimes situations can be misinterpreted. I actually laughed right towards the end because it was quite funny. I cut it out though, obviously. But yeah, I thought it was a really good story. I really liked tonight's stories. Please let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Sadly, we did not hit the 1,000 comments like I would have liked. Maybe we can do it today? That would be pretty awesome. I'm probably going to stop asking tomorrow if we don't make it. But thank you. If you liked the video, do drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and if you're new here, it would mean a lot to me if you would subscribe. I do post new content for you to binge on every night, so be sure to hit the little bell icon to be up to date every time I post. That would be pretty awesome too. If there's a story that you would like to share and have read on the channel soon, feel free to post it to my Reddit or send it to my email. Just please be generous with your punctuation, paragraphings, and descriptions, as it goes a long way. But anyway, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.